Hello, everyone. A very warm welcome to another exciting episode of Psychology Talks. And today we're going to discuss how to achieve peak performance. In generally, employees are overworked, they are stressed because timelines are short and they're always required to deliver more than what they have been actually expected for. So there's a constant pressure on them to perform well, to be among the peak performers. To some extent, they can achieve. Usually, some employees do achieve peak performance, but the main problem is that they cannot sustain that performance during the long run. Uh, as you can, as it is a general fact that if there is too much stress, it is likely to lead burnout. So that's why I have invited today my guest speaker who has developed a program from where she actually used the principle of science and psychology to develop this program, and she provides coaching to sustain that peak performance over the long time. Her name is Carla Fowler. She is the double doctor. She is the doctor, like the medical doctor and the Ph.D. doctor. So when I actually got to know about her, I was so inspired that, oh my God, that she is like not only the doctor in the medical way, but also a PhD doctor. So and she's also a founder of THAXA Elite Executive Coaching company. And her performance enhancement principles are so unique and so practical that it delivers result. So let's welcome Dr. Carla. Hello, Dr. Carla. Thank you so much for joining us today.
Oh, thank you so much, Amberine, for having me, and good afternoon.
Yeah, and good afternoon, good morning, or good night.
Yes.
I mean, good evening to because a lot of people are joining from across the world, and a lot of people have
Yeah.
already joined. And those who have joined, please let us know from where are you joining, and if you have any question or if you have comment, please keep it coming, and we'll just include your comment or question during our discussion. And so Andrea has joined, Marco Forbato has joined, Deepak has joined, Fahim, Dr. Mansoor, Karan. So thank you so much for joining today. And I hope you will enjoy our today's session and you will learn a lot because we have an amazing personality, Dr. Carla. She is the best in her field, and she knows how to sustain performance over the longer period of time. So, Dr. Carla, thank you so much for joining us today. It is an honor to have you today. I have given a little bit of introduction to our audience, but just tell us a little bit more about what actually inspired you to do two doctor, I mean PhD and then a doctor, and then to develop this program. So just tell us maybe a little bit more
Sure.
about how were your early life, and then maybe
Yeah.
why you choose this particular field.
Well, it's interesting. So I did not set out, to go on the exact path that I ended up taking. I wasn't someone who grew up even knowing that I wanted to be a doctor. But when I was young, what I did know is that I really liked math and science. I think I liked the idea that the world was full of challenges or puzzles that could be solved and that you could have some principles or methodology around it to help you work through problems. And so I think as a young person, that was something that really drew me to those fields. And the other thing that, of course, my family always jokes about is that I think I've been interested in high performance from a very young age. And, when you're young, you think about it like, oh, who, performs well at the track meet? Maybe in the sports realm, or, you're aware of like who performs well at school. But I was always really interested in how it was that people did that and learning from other people, watching other people. But also, I was really interested in using myself as like the test subject and just really trying a number of different things. So that was what I think I was like as a young person. And I loved sports, so I loved math and science. And I went off to become an engineer because that was the one job I knew of that was a very sort of mathematically based job. But I rapidly in college realized that I was interested in human problems. So I really wanted to have more access to helping human beings directly. And so that was how I steered my course more towards medicine. And then there's a funny story that I had a friend in college who told me they had these programs where you get an MD and a PhD, and that actually they would pay for your education if you did both instead of in the United States, obviously for medical school, you pay a lot of money to go. And I was like, wow, that sounds like a lot of fun. And also, it sounds like a really good deal. And so that is how I started on what was almost a 10-year training program to both be trained as a medical doctor and to get a PhD. And I think some of the things that I found most gratifying about that were both learning how to talk with people and help them think through really high stakes decisions about, their medical care and their health, and really connecting with them, trying to be strategic about it, but like learning that skill of being able to dialogue and work with them in that way. And from my scientific training, I think one of the most gratifying pieces was really learning how to think hard about a problem that had a lot of uncertainty in it. So as a scientist, you show up every day to work and your job is actually to learn something that nobody else knows yet. And so there is this uncertainty just built into the job. And you're learning how to create structure where there's no structure, and how to go about that investigative process. So you can fast forward to the part where I'm now having to choose what specialty to go into. And this is where a really big challenge and pivot came for me. And that was that I never quite found my home in medicine. So I went off to train in surgery because I loved the high performance of the surgeons. There's a physical art to it, but there's also like a decision-making art to it. You always have to decide, are we going to operate or are we not going to operate? And that's a very binary choice. It's not a nuanced choice. You can't try a little bit of the medicine like you can in other specialties. You have to decide, and then you have to own the consequences of that decision. But I also really liked the more kind of human-centric piece of psychology and psychiatry. And, the psychiatrists were like, Carla, you would have a home here. You have some natural instincts around this. And so I came to this challenge of not quite finding my home, because what I really wanted was both of those things. I wanted to think about the psychology of high performance and do that, but I also wanted to create a place where I could really connect with people and their challenges as they're going after their goals. And so that is actually what led me to found a practice that was outside of medicine, that was more entrepreneurial, and that was in the coaching field. And then to take all the things I'd been learning and use them in a really different way, to create a methodology, to work with people using performance science. And so that is what I did 10 years ago. And I will tell you, it was not a popular decision. I think it shocked a lot of people. And building a business, you start from zero. Like, you don't have clients, you have to pitch people. So that's what I've been doing for the last 10 years. And I'm happy to report that, it took a lot of work. I had to put a lot of my own performance principles to work for myself. And it does take a lot of endurance, but I really love the methodology that I've built, and it's really exciting to see, and also to get to share now, like in our conversation, some of the ideas that I've found to be most useful. So, anyways.
That's quite quite much and quite inspiring, to be honest, because two things that I actually got from your conversation now is basically you followed your passion, and which is not easy, because as you mentioned that when you try to follow these things, like when you actually do the doctor, complete your medical doctor, right? So people actually expect you to work and do the job, but you actually
Yes.
chose to actually do the PhD. And then again, that's somehow, of course, there was some link to it that you said that they will pay for it, but again, there is always a lot of resistance from people to, they may push you to what they think is right for you. But
Yes.
I'm glad that you followed your passion. And then, as you mentioned, that you always driven to understand that how or what are the basic components that makes like performance better,
Yeah.
or to
Yes.
help a human to achieve a peak performance. So that is something like not everybody can do it, and I'm glad that you did it. So yeah,
Thank you.
that's really heartening to see that people follow their passion despite whatever people say to them, and not to follow that. So that's amazing. And then a lot of people are actually saying a lot of things like congratulations, and that's a great
Thank
story.
you.
And so thank you so much for your comments about this. Okay, so moving on to the discussion, that as you said that you have discovered some of uh, the principles that creates peak performance. So in your opinion, what are these basic principles that can help people to achieve peak performance under this stressful situation?
Yeah. Well, one of the interesting things about performance science is the first job that I had to do as I was thinking
Yeah.
about how to make it really applicable for people. Because I didn't want it to be an academic exercise. Like I had moved out of academia. I didn't want to be there, publishing, just thinking and publishing. I wanted to work with people and help them use it. And so one of the first things I actually had to do was start to distill all of the ideas out there to kind of sort through the noise, and try and understand what was really most important. Because I think that one of the challenges can be we all read things on LinkedIn or in the popular news or the blogs, and there are just so many ideas. Do this, don't do this, do this, and it's overwhelming. And as you said, many people are overworked. And the idea of even getting started on it when there's that much input, and it's hard to tell what's true, what's not, what's going to work for you, what's not. So I think that's one of the first challenges we often have to overcome. But for me, I tried to simplify like all of the ideas I hear into like three big buckets. And the buckets that I break performance science down into are number one, you can think about the idea of strategy or focus. And it's this thought that not everything you do has an equal impact towards the goals that you have. And
Yes.
so, one of the first jobs we have is to say, what are really the most important or the most impactful things I could do versus trying to figure out how we will do all of it. So, instead, we
Yeah.
take the standpoint of, I will absolutely not do all of it. And
Yes.
instead, my job is to figure out and to pick and choose and be selective. And so, like, the first principle I always start with in that strategy bucket is
Yeah.
this idea of brutal focus. And I call it brutal focus because when we look around, we have this sense that everyone is doing everything, right? Like everyone else is
Yeah.
doing it all. Somehow we are the only person who is limited by the
That's
24 hours.
absolutely
and
yes.
um, and that, I mean, that's like, it feels lonely and it just, we feel like we're failing, but really everyone has to choose. And so it feels a little painful because uh, normally to really start to approach a goal we have when we don't have a lot of time, we have to be more selective than we are normally. And often that means letting go of some things. And it feels a little painful because it feels not normal. So
Yeah.
that is brutal focus. Really getting clarity about what of all the things you could want, do you want the most? And then, secondly, what's really most important to get there? So that's like
Yeah.
principle number one from the strategy
Amazing.
bucket.
Yeah.
And we could certainly talk about the other two buckets and my other two big principles if that feels
Yeah.
like a good place to go next.
Yeah, I mean, that's so much I can relate to what you said, is choosing what to actually give attention to is the most important thing. Because as you mentioned that, people are doing lots of things. That doesn't mean that we have to follow whatever they are doing. We need to find out what are our capabilities, what are our, uh, our passion for that. So, what are our interests? Like few days ago, I actually shared my post. I have lots of interest, to be honest, because I like to paint, I like to cook, I like to
Yes.
do like spirituality thing. But I need to focus where I am interested about and where I find myself. Right? I do have lots of interest. I do whenever I have the time. Maybe I do paint and draw, but need to focus that what exactly you're good at or what gives you the most satisfaction. So completely relate to what you're saying. So now I'm really want to understand to hear from you about the two other buckets that you mentioned.
Okay,
Yeah,
awesome.
yeah,
So we talked about first bucket is
yeah,
strategy. Like if we can start by being selective and really focus about which ones to do. Then the
yeah,
second bucket is really about execution. So once we've identified, okay, what do we think is going to give us the most impact? Then we have to think about, well, what might be the most effective or efficient way to actually do those things? And at work, often it's not us doing the things, it may be us helping our team do the thing, right? Like where the execution
yeah,
happens, not just as a single player game, but also with a group of people. And what I have found is really the most important principle in this area, and it is both true for ourselves, but also true if we are a leader of people. Is this idea of helping ourselves learn how to cultivate power? And what I mean by that is there's a couple different areas that we could think about having influence on what happens and really making things happen. And so I think number one, like we know how to have sort of discipline or how to motivate ourselves to do
yeah,
something new, to approach it, to build some momentum with it is a wonderful thing to be thinking about. And I certainly have some tools of how I approach that. But
yeah,
secondly, sometimes there's a new skill we need to learn, or we need to help our teams learn how
yeah,
to do something new, have some failures. Like, that's okay. That's a piece of the learning process. And learn how to build their capabilities. And of
yeah,
course, workplaces where we feel like we're being developed and there's room for growth are often way more engaging and satisfying than workplaces where we feel stuck, where there aren't opportunities for that. And I think it relates back to, again, that sense of like, are we growing in our power and our ability to influence and make things happen that we want to have happen? Um,
yeah,
and then I think the third piece of cultivating power is often about visibility. So it's not just saying what our performance is, but it's also saying, are people seeing my performance? And in the
okay, yeah,
workplace, of course, sometimes that is the boss seeing my performance. Like, am I
hmm,
able to showcase my team's performance so that other teams are aware and can recognize them for that? So that's kind of a third piece that I think is sometimes missed is how are we creating a network for ourselves? How are we making our performance visible so people know
yeah,
that the value we can bring? So
yeah.
that's like my second principle around just that execution bucket.
Yeah, that's amazing. I have one question that is you mentioned that
Yes.
there's a like visibility because I've seen a lot of high performers actually losing this thing because they may be good at doing things, but they don't know how to make themselves visible because could be because of their personality, because they could be introvert or they don't know how to present themselves. Simply they could be like extrovert also, but they don't know how to
Of
present. So
course.
how do you recommend that they should make themselves visible?
Great question. And there's a couple different contexts in which this might happen. So,
Okay.
one context we could take is just in thinking about networks as a source, like a great asset that we have. And when I think about networking, I actually think about like one-on-one relationships
Yeah.
with people, whether it's across your industry or your communities, who you are interested in and who you are sharing with, and you are letting them share with you. And so one of the ways we create visibility is simply by, when we meet with people, like being curious about what they're doing. So you're giving them the opportunity to be visible to you, and also really being ready to share what you're doing. They're
Yeah.
interested. It's not bragging. It's not, being, too much like, look at me, particularly if you're doing it in a conversation. So that's just like
Yeah.
one example that, again, it makes a coffee meeting way more interesting when someone
Yeah.
else gets the chance to share with you, like, what are you excited about these days? What are you really proud of? What's your team been
Yeah.
up to? These are wonderful gift questions you can ask someone.
Mm-hmm.
And similarly, you can say, well, I'm really excited to tell you about something that we recently finished that I'm just feeling really proud about. Or I see a lot of opportunities going forward and I want to collaborate. So like, let's talk about it. In the workplace, creating visibility is sometimes can feel a little more challenging. Just again, the sense of not wanting to be overly self-promoting. We may have all
Mm-hmm.
seen those people who were just like, ugh,
Yeah,
shut
that's
up,
true.
shut up already.
Okay, yeah, absolutely. They all the time, just they all the talks and no work or no
Yeah.
actions. Yeah.
But
So,
yeah. But also, like, we have to look for opportunities and ways that there's actually value in you communicating and sharing what you're accomplishing. So, for example,
yeah.
sometimes one-on-ones, if that is a piece with someone who is above you, or with your peers, for example, being able to talk about things from the standpoint of, why is it valuable for them to know what we're up to?
Yeah.
And when you approach it from that standpoint, you both get to showcase your team or showcase yourself, but you're also actually giving something to the group so that, for example, they know, like, oh, if you figured out that problem, we're having something similar happening in our group. Hey, can we meet and chat about that? Or also, if you can frame it in the sense of, hey, we're moving forwards with this thing, which is actually going to help our group win at some
Yeah.
future opportunity or challenge that's happening. That's another way. For example, someone could frame something to make it
Mm-hmm.
visible, but not have it just feel like shameless
Yeah.
self-promotion.
Absolutely wonderful advice. I think the 2 points that I actually gained from your conversation today now, it's basically to be more intentional and not just be focusing on bragging about your achievements or something. It's all about sharing what you're doing, not just make it more like a conversation. Like, it's what I've seen, like people feel that you just don't need to talk about the other things. Maybe you can talk about work, but in a way that can link with you and relate to
Yeah.
you. So and that should be natural, I would say. It shouldn't look that you're promoting yourself. Otherwise, as you said, they're like people who are actually talking about, and they're more like all the talks and no action. So be more authentic and be more natural in a way. So I think that can help. Okay, so I'm also excited about the third bucket. So
Third
what is
bucket.
it? Yeah, yeah.
Well, the third bucket, I think, is all about our mindset. So now we're back. We are at the psychology.
Yeah,
um, and
my
you could
favorite.
think about that. That third bucket is, if we've kind of selected what we think is most important and we focus that, now we're thinking about the execution. How do we create that influence for ourselves so we can get things done, or our teams can get things done? And then that third bucket is really about, well, how do we sustain motivation? How do we sustain or find our confidence? Like, what is it that fuels a lot of the effort that goes into those other two buckets? And so that's where we end up at mindset. And I have found that one of the most challenging things around mindset, or the psychology of it, is often how we face uncertainty, like how we face situations where we feel like we don't have control. And the thought of, how do we learn to thrive even in those settings that are particularly challenging for us as human beings? So,
Yeah.
my principle in this area is to help folks learn to relish uncertainty. And the thing
Yeah.
about it is that we sometimes equate uncertainty with risk. So, sort of the
Yeah.
negative side of opportunity, but also areas where there's uncertainty are also places that have the most opportunity. And
Yeah.
this is it's also a place where we have the opportunity to do something that scares us, that is a challenge, and we actually get to overcome it. And I have found that that is actually one of the most motivating things, both for a
Mm-hmm.
team to do together, but also just
Wow.
as individuals. When we feel stagnant and like we're not growing, even if things are easy and we are accomplishing them, we don't feel at our peak. We don't
Yeah.
actually feel fully expressed. And so, in some ways, uncertainty is necessary for us
Yeah.
to have that feeling of like, I did it and I believe I could do it again. And in fact, I actually see that maybe I could do something even more challenging. And
Yeah.
so this is these are some of the ideas that I bring up and I explore with folks around where can uncertainty be good and how
Yeah.
might we learn to appreciate that. Um,
Yeah.
and one of the ways that I help people practice is this idea of running good experiments. So I love
Oh, yeah.
science.
Yeah.
I love
That's good.
science, and you can't take the scientist out of me. And so I love to think about science outside of the lab in our own lives, where we say,
Yeah.
I have a hypothesis about something I
Mhm.
want to try to overcome a challenge or improve my performance. And so, what I'm going to do is I'm going to design an experiment. Like, here's maybe I'm going to try something different as I present to the meeting.
Mhm.
Here's what I'm going to do. I'm going to try it for at least 3 meetings, for example, so that I make
Mhm.
sure I really get the hang of running it in the new way. And then I'm going to ask people for feedback. Or I'm going to
Yeah.
record my own feedback of like, how did it feel? Like, did it feel better? And you could even define other ways you might uh, decide whether it was more effective. Like, for example, did more people follow through on what they committed to, for example? And then you can define and think about like, okay, do I want to keep doing that? And sometimes it works. You know what? Sometimes it
Yeah.
doesn't work. And
Yeah.
that's okay because
That's-
it's just one experiment. And so I love this as a way to try things and to lean into uncertainty, but in safe, manageable ways.
I absolutely love this term because the idea of uncertainty is actually taken mostly negatively. Because most of the time, people are afraid of this term uncertainty because all the time, if you even at the corporate world, people are trying to make a strategy to remove this uncertainty from their, strategy and from their marketing plans or all these plans. But the way you actually reframed the thought process and taking the uncertainty as a force to push it forward, this is simply amazing. And but again, I would just say that, as you mentioned, that experiment can be failure also. So I understand that, like, maybe one time it's okay to fail, but what happens if you fail multiple times? How to actually, because initially motivation is enough to deal with the first few failures, but if you keep on facing these kind of failures or maybe a setback after this, how do you deal with that?
That is a great question. So,
Yeah.
one of the things I like about running experiments is that you always get the moment to change how you're doing something. And sometimes, if something's really not working, that's actually data to listen to. And rather, the reaction doesn't have to be like to feel bad about yourself, but instead to say, there's something interesting happening here and I need to understand it. Um, And certainly, just as a way to mitigate, if you're out running experiments, particularly in the workplace, you can always tell people that what you're doing. So for example, and I think that also can take some pressure off if you let like your mentor or your boss know like, hey, I'm working on my presentation skills. I'd like to be more effective in meetings. I'm going to be trying some things. And so just wanted to give you the heads up. Like my thought is they'll be better, but it's possible that they won't be. And so, but it lets the other person know you are being intentional. So back to what you said of like the intentionality, but back to this idea of like, yeah, running experiments and not getting success is really hard. I had many days like that in the lab.
Yeah.
And,
Yeah.
but one of the things my mentor really just like kind of infused in me was to get out of the mindset of like, I failed or this didn't work or it's
Yeah.
broken, and much more into the like, what is this trying to tell me? And to
Yeah.
really just think about where does it point me to look next? And so sometimes if you've had a couple of like, let's just say failures in a row, that's a good time to take a step back and say, how good are my feedback loops? Like how much do I
Yeah.
trust them? And if you do trust them and you're like, no, those are good feedback loops, then to say, great, I'm going to run a different type of experiment. So you don't have to keep like banging your head against the same
Mhm.
wall.
Yeah.
And, but I think separating yourself from the experiment and the data is helpful. One other suggestion, these are just some, I don't know if you want to call them like a mantra or just like helpful quotes to remember are, there
Yeah.
is more than one good way to get somewhere. And so this is like, if something's
Amazing.
not
Yeah.
working, it's okay to try a different methodology. There's more than one good place to get to. I mean, the number of
Yeah.
major
That's,
scientific breakthroughs that were actually mistakes that then led somewhere that we hadn't even conceived of
yeah.
become really interesting. And
Yeah.
then the last piece I say is give your future self some credit. Like,
Yes.
trust your future self because like you don't always have all the data in this moment to solve the future's problems, but you can trust yourself to be capable and thoughtful in the future when you actually do encounter those things. And
Yeah.
so I find that
Yeah.
those
That's
can be very helpful as well.
Yeah, that's amazing. Actually, what I feel is that, when you face like these failures and something, and as you mentioned, that we need to change the way we think about it. As you know, if these are the pointers that maybe from the universe we are getting, that maybe it leads to somewhere else. It's not necessarily like, sometimes um, we are stuck to the problem itself, that okay, we need to find the solution for the same problem. It's not something like, we don't need to get ourselves stuck to one situation or to one problem. It's just about expanding ourselves to look at the different possibilities and different opportunities. I think that's very true to to find new ways. And as you mentioned, you know, it could be the mistake that could lead to somewhere else. And I would just also point out here that, it's always a journey that we should enjoy, not the destination. We should just keep in mind that okay, to reach there no matter what. There are different ways, different routes, and they could be distances that we could reach. So that's one thing that we need to keep in mind all the time. So I know this is such a wonderful topic, and we can keep talking and you so of course share a lot of information, but unfortunately that we're reaching to the end of the show, and we can definitely have another of the people that reach out to you. So before I actually close the show, what one piece of advice would you give to our audience today to achieve peak performance during the stressful time?
Well, this is actually an orthogonal piece of advice because I think we spent a lot of the show talking about the principles of peak performance. And I think one of the things we miss sometimes when we're doing it is that we sort of feel that peak performance has to happen by like putting our head down and grinding. And the truth is, when we try to sustain performance over a long period of time, my advice is also make sure you have some good now. So sometimes that means we need a moment to not be brutally focused. You need to paint because you want to paint. You need to cook because right now in this moment you want to cook. And there will be time, and yes, you'll put aside time to work on the things that really you are pushing your performance on. But I think my biggest advice for thinking on the long arcs is that you have to keep yourself in the game. And so I often find that the sort of orthogonal wisdom to all the performance wisdom is have some good now. Because again, it is a journey and it's a long journey, and life is made up of both kinds of things.
Amazing. That's great. I think Karen is actually asking a question. I'll use the data that it doesn't work and to do more of what work. Then also be aware that you need to be open to try experiment. Nothing is tasty for these days. So you just need to confirm. So that's right? The question she asked.
Yeah, things are moving very quickly.
Yeah, that's great. So, anyways, we had a wonderful discussion, and we learned a lot from. And I can see from the comments the level of excitement and enthusiasm from the audience. The way is quite much, and I'm sure they learned a lot. So, what is the best way to reach out to you? You are very active on LinkedIn, or is there any way they can message you or reach out to you?
So a great place to find me is on LinkedIn, and I'm at Carla-Fowler, and we'll make sure to put that in the show notes as well. And so if you want to follow along for conversations about performance science, that's where I post them. And then if you want to learn more about my coaching practice, my website is a great resource. So that is THAXA.com, THAXA. So you can message me there as well.
That's great. I'm gonna post your website in the comments after the show, so people who are maybe watching this on the replay, they get to know. Of course, I'll post on the different channels. There, people can contact you through your website or through your LinkedIn profile. So thank you so much for joining us today and sharing these wonderful insights. I'm sure our audience have learned a lot. Even I have learned a lot from you, that how to see performance online and achieve performance. So thanks for these wonderful insights. And have a great day.